Lembrou, tirar uma foto de todo mundo.
Opa! Às vezes a gente tira agora, não, porque a Rafa vai embora. Hein? Vamos tirar uma foto agora, porque a Rafa vai embora. Nós já estamos live streaming. Tirar uma foto, por favor. Vamos tirar ali, né, com a cintinha. Pegando os livros. Aqui, ó. A máquina profissa.
É só apertar?
Gente, vai querer foto? Vamos, então vamos ver hoje. Oh, não. Aqui embaixo é melhor? Será? Vamos? Acho que talvez. Não, acho que não vai pegar, não. Aqui. Pega mais. Você dá pra pegar os livros? Não. Você quer segurar? Tá uma boa. Não sei. Talvez. Será que cabe? Tá cabendo a mão todo mundo?
Tá, você tem que passar.
Pode ser apertar um pouquinho, vai faltar. Dá pra pegar logo atrás?
Tá pegando a logo atrás. Tá pegando um dos livros. Vê se tá, ok. Só que ele
Quer mostrar a chave?
Como é que é isso?
Mas
Mais certo?
tá.
Deixa eu tirar o mais certo. Sim?
Exatamente. Gostei. Vamos lá. Acho que tá, já tá live stream, tem que ver se tá saindo som, mas
Mano, depois aquela foto, não sei como. Depois de passar. E as outras aqui a gente vai postar nas páginas do certo. Massa.
Oh, you're done?
Okay.
Oh, yeah, take your time. No rush.
I can respond to that
Yeah.
one later.
Não, tem razão. Tem que passar.
Acho que deve ter.
Só mais um minuto. É outro link agora. Vou publicar agora. Discussão? Eles mudaram agora. Vai.
Okay, let's go on. We have now a paper by Iago Condé and Rafaela Leite. Both PhD students here in FMG. Both have the bedrock of being supervised by me.
mexer. Vou aproveitar.
Can I begin? Yeah. So, hi. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I thank you, Professor Weissman, for being so kind to us. Also, our supervisor here, Leandro, for all the support through all these years. And our friend and professor as well, frankly. If it weren't for you, this would not have happened, you know that, so thank you. Okay, so this presentation is about a work in progress written by Rafaela and me. And I must say that it was Rafaela who came up with the idea of dealing with this very objection raised by Derek Parfit against an argument raised by John Rawls against utilitarianism, and which Professor Weissman clarifies the role played by this objection in Rawls's political term. So we believe, and I would like to recall that I'm very grateful, Rafael, because you invited me to develop this work together with you. It's been a great pleasure. I believe we are learning a lot with each other, and you know, it's her idea. She needs to take the credits for it, right? So I believe that what was Rafaela's concern and my own is that this is a very specific and difficult to understand objection challenge raised by firstly by Derek Parfit. And it's not only to understand on its own terms, but it's also somehow difficult to locate it in the works by John Rawls. So what's the role played by it, and what's the matter? So why is it important for Rawls' political term? Thank you. I think that we acknowledge that Professor Weissman himself has written down a very clarifying text on it, so it's very clear why this is a challenge to Rawls. And so our work is mainly a reconstruction of this debate, right? Because there are first Rawls's own works, then Parfit challenge, and after that Samuel Scheffer's article, and Rawls's political liberalism. So it's mainly a reconstruction of this debate. So there's nothing new, right? But we also believe that we should take some time to check whether Rawls's response to it in political liberalism in his late work is sufficient. It's, you know, Parfit would be satisfied by this response. So that's what we try to do. It's not entirely new. It's also a reconstruction based on Weissman's white political liberalism, but we try to clarify what's the proper Rawlsian response to Derek Parfit. Okay, so my presentation is divided into 3 parts. The first one is just to clarify these actors, Rawls, Parfit, Scheffer, Weissman, also what's the deal, what's the order of the objections, and so on. The second part is a reconstruction of Weissman's statement on why does it matter for the political term by Rawls. And the last one is just to check whether the response of political liberalism is fine, is a good response to Parfit, right? So those are the 3 parts, and if anything is not clear, if I'm speaking too fast or not, please interrupt me, and you may you know, raise questions at any time, any moment. Okay. So our presentation is called The Objection of the Parfit Himself in Rawls's Political Time. So we first need to grasp what does this mean? What is this some mysterious Parfit himself? Well, let's recall and let's make it in the chronological order, right? So our story begins. Actually, it begins with a theory of justice published in 1971. Everybody knows that. This fine professor called John Rawls written this the greatest theory of justice of all times, and it changes everything. But okay. Later on, in 1973, Derek Parfit raises an objection to which in this article called Larry Selby's and sorry, I can just remind us the name of the article. Anyway, it's called Larry Selby's and and moral principles, right? Later Selby's and moral principles. So that's 1973. And Parfit tries to show that one of the arguments presented by John Rawls against utilitarianism was wrong because it did not relate well to conceptions of identity. So that's our main theme, our main subject here, right? Conceptions of identity. What Parfit says is that, Rawls came up with this argument against utilitarianism, which is that utilitarianism does not take seriously the difference between the persons, because it's just a maximization, so it doesn't matter to whom the resources are distributed. John Rawls argues that this is not a proper solution to the problem of justice, so Parfit comes up with an argument against that says, well, maybe utilitarianism does not take this difference seriously because it should not. It's not the difference we should rely on. Why is that? Well, in order to show that, Parfit describes two visions of the problem of the concept of personal identity, right? So these are the simple view and the complex view. And I'll explain it now. So the simple view tells us that these conceptions of identity are of a special nature, and they function as a matter of our nothing. So either you have a continuous personal identity or not. There are no degrees of identity, right? Okay, that's the simple view, and it could be the view upon which Rawls stands. But there's another conception of the problem of identity, which is the complex view, which sounds more interesting to Parfit, and which says that personal identities are a very profound fact about human nature. All we can rely on are some corporal and psychological continuities that can be similar in kind, but are maintained by connections that differ in degrees. So whether my identity is continuous or not, that may vary in degrees. And there's a good example of that, right, Rafael? Imagine that someone converts into a different religion. So out of a sudden, the life of this person changes a lot. And we might conceive that, okay, these are not the same person anymore. So these are not the same identity. So there's no continuity, or there's a little continuity in a lesser degree. Right? So it's not a matter of power or nothing. It's a matter of degrees. This person is not the same anymore. And the problem of that is to show that this argument against utilitarianism fails because, this deep fact about human nature is not a deep fact at all. Right? So that's Derek Parfit's challenge to Rawls. Later on, Rawls in 1975 writes The Independence of Moral Theory, which is a very important and famous article. And in this article, there are several things being discussed, and there's this lesson, this counter-objection, which I'm going to quote Rawls. So, the feasibility of moral conceptions is largely settled by psychological and social theory, and by the theory of the corresponding well-ordered societies. The reasonableness of these conceptions, given that they are feasible, is then settled by their content. That is, by the kind of society their principles direct us to strive for, and by the kind of person they encourage us to be. So, what Rawls is saying that is that there's some kind of independence between psychological findings and discoveries and philosophy of the mind, of conceptions of identity, and moral theory. But because the type of society, the type of institutions we live under, they incentive different kinds of personality. So personality also depends on moral theory and not just the other way around, just like Parfit was described, right? I will quote Rawls again. He says that there's no degree of connectedness between identities that is natural or fixed. The actual continuities and sense of purpose in people's lives is relative to the socially achieved moral conception. End of quote. That's the independence of moral theory, 1975. Right? So, fair enough. Later on comes our friend Samuel Scheffler in 1979 and writes that he tries to show that Rawls is not entirely right. There are some problems with this response by Rawls, which is, if no degree of continuity, if no conception of identity is natural or fixed, how come you try to use one of these conceptions in the original position, in your moral theory? Right? You cannot presuppose one of these conceptions because if it's something that moral theory might say, and you are moral theorist, so you need to argue for that conception. You cannot use it as an assumption, right? I believe that's one of the problems identified by Samuel Scheffler. But in this reconstruction, we intend to show that there are two different issues here, and we will focus on one of them because it's the most important for Rawls' political term, right? So one is this argument against utilitarianism, whether it proceeds, whether if it's right or not. If one checks Scheffler's text and Parfit's as well, you see a whole discussion over it. But that's not our focus here. We are trying to deal with a different problem identified by Parfit and later on by Scheffler, which is the very conception of the person that comes into play in the original position by Rawls. Okay, so that's our main subject, our main theme here, and that's the end of the first part. So, what does it all have to do with Rawls' political term? Why does it matter? I believe that Professor Whiteman is pretty clear on that. We didn't need to, we don't need no reconstruction to see that because it's very clear, at least, how this debate affects a theory of justice. So Rawls's early account. So we need to recall that the problem identified by Rawls in this earlier account is a matter of stability, right? That's our first assumption here. And I cannot, in detail, describe for you all the way to stability, all the arguments. Read Professor Whiteman's work, it's pretty clear on it. But we need to settle some things. First, it's a conception of inherent stability. So we cannot rely, of course, on external devices in order to achieve stability. Second, it's based on the rising and maintenance of some effective sense of justice by citizens, right? Citizens will come up and maintain the sense of justice, and that's why they would affirm the conception of justice. Third, there's this general strategy carried on by John Rawls in his earlier account, which is to show congruence. Congruence between, it's a match between the good and the just. So what he's trying to do is show that if you want to be just, you act justly, to maintain your sense of justice. It's congruent to be to carry on a good life. So how does it do it? Well, it tries to show that in a well-ordered society, so now we are, not yet, but somehow one of those points of view explained by Professor Marcus Fanton. So the point of view of citizens in a well-ordered society. We call it, it's an ideal model, it's a hypothesis, it's not real world, here and now, okay? So, in a well-ordered society, some ideals or conceptions would grow, they would be valued by citizens, and Rawls tries to show that in order to live up to these ideals, people would need to be just, right? So the only way of realizing those ideas which people value is to be just, after all. And that's part of the argument. And one of these ideals is a conception of person as rational and reasonable, as free and equal, right? And so, because of this ideal, people would choose to regulate their behavior as to comply with those principles which would be chosen in the original position. And why is that? Because that's a procedure of choice made up of the essential features of this conception of person. So what the original position do is to show us a way to choose between principles, rival principles of justice, and select those who are better related to this conception of the person. Okay? And what's the matter here? Why is that debate over identity, over conceptions of identity, a problem here? That's because this interest and how it relates to the unity of reason and some aspects of the original position, they presuppose some Kantian elements upon which we would not agree in a pluralist society, right? So the freedom to go wherever the practical reason takes us would lead us to different results regarding identity, regarding personality, regarding how we might unify our reasons. And so this argument, which is called by Professor Whiteman, the Kantian argument for congruence, it fails because it presupposes some conception of identity which was previously ruled out on this debate between Rawls, Parfit, and Sheffield. So that's a great interpretation of Rawls's work, because if one reads carefully the introduction to political liberalism, one sees that Rawls says that, that's when I read Sheffield's article, so I got some ideas, and it was one of the main reasons, not the only one, but why I took my political turn. So Professor Whiteman explains why. It has to do with this debate over identity, right? To see that, imagine, so this is an example by Professor Whiteman as well, a citizen of a well-ordered society named Joan. There are two great examples to deal with that. One is of a religious person, the other is of a person who conceives himself, his identity, in a partisan way, which means that she believes that there's no deep continuity between her identities. So imagine that, once again, that example of somebody who converts into a different religion, and everything changes. The values, the ideas, the conceptions, the life, the behavior, the character, everything changes. So it does not make sense to presuppose the idea of identity, at least not for this person. So some conditions of the original position would not be conditions which respond to the idea of identity raised by this person, right? So it's not a right argument. We will not convince her to follow the principles of justice made up by Rawls, because it's not her conception of the person, right? So it explains why Rawls took his political turn and what the problem was with a theory of justice. And now we get to, in our last part, the solution, which Rawls came up with, which is political liberalism, and his political constructivism, and his its fundamental ideas of society, of the person, so the political conception of the person, and a new account of stability, right? Okay. So we consider whether the architecture of political liberalism in fact provides a proper reply to that objection of the partisan self. And okay, we are going to show that solution first, describing Rawls's conception of the person, explained and used in political liberalism, which is a political conception of the person. And but we think that that's pretty clear, right? If one reads the Dewey Lectures, the first chapters of political liberalism, Rawls explicitly deals with partisan objection. That's fine. There's no such a great need of reconstruction there. But you know, as I have already said, and that's one of Whiteman's theses, the political turn is about stability. So we would like to test whether this conception of the person would survive stability, would enhance stability in a well-ordered society as conceived in the political liberalism, right? So, first step, the political conception of the person. Well, that's a political conception because it stems from the political culture. So this idea of the person is found in the political culture of modern, democratic, liberal societies, right? There's no mystery there. So the origin of this conception of person is not some deep account of philosophy, either metaphysics, of course not. There was Whiteman also argues that for that, but it's found in political culture. And this conception of identity has two parts, two aspects. The first of them is a political or institutional identity. And this identity corresponds to what we experience living under free, just institutions. So the duty and duties, the duties and rights that we have, the political life itself, the character, all this raises some ideals, and in these ideals, this conception is related to one part of our identity, which is the institutional identity, right? So this is just one part. The other part is called moral or non-institutional identity, because it relies on conceptions, ideas, values provided by its citizens on comprehensive doctrines. So it's not the same for every citizen, because we live in pluralist societies. A well-ordered society would also be a pluralist one, and people would carry different doctrines, different comprehensive doctrines. And that's why they would raise and maintain different ideas of identity related to this non-institutional identity. And what Rawls is saying is that, okay, this identity, this non-institutional identity may vary. It's, well, there are several degrees of continuity, and so maybe Parker is right about it, but the institutional or political identity is maintained because institutions of the well-ordered society they play some educative role, and they change the character and the values which the citizens care, and this is enough to maintain their identity in public sphere, public life. So these two parts are unified somehow, but that's up to the comprehensive doctrines maintained by Citizen, right? The political theorist does not have an answer to that. He deals only with this institutional part of identity. Okay, and is it stable? How can you show that this is stable? So now we get to the point of view of the citizen as explained by Marcus Fanton. And now, as this point of view is explained and used in political liberty, right? So this is the last part of the presentation. And it goes on like that. You may be, at least if you weren't by now, you already are familiar with some of the main ideas of political liberalism, which are the overlapping consensus and the idea of public reason, and this idea of well-ordered society. So what we see is that all those ideas help us understand why there would be this continuity of the institutional identity, right? So what we argue is that this constitutional, institutional political identity would remain in a well-ordered society. And why is that? So first we need to understand that comprehensive doctrines are amenable to change, right? They are not fixed. So what people value, what people believe in, they are amenable to change. And why would they change, after all? Well, because living under free, just institutions, some values, some ideals, some conceptions could be raised, and there's a great incentive for them to grow and to be cultivated by citizens. And so this is a part of what we mean when we say that institutions of a well-ordered society play an educative and transformative role, right? So this role in turn encourages the maintenance of this institutional conception of identity, which is limited to the public sphere, of course. We're talking about political liberalism now, but which would allow us to properly respond to profit, right? So maybe you're right. Some aspects of our identity may change, and people may conceive their identity differently. Maybe it's not continuous, but as long as we take part in political life, as we experience political life, and become and we become different persons who live under these institutions, we would maintain this idea. And why is that stable? Because just like in his earlier account, Rawls argues that some ideas and conceptions would be valued by citizens. The difference is that these ideals now are related to the political sphere, the political realm. So I'm talking about an ideal of civic friendship, for instance, an ideal of democratic governance, an ideal of citizenship, which tells us how to behave in the public sphere. These ideals would be valued as long as we live under free, just institutions. And these ideals are what help citizens to affirm the political conception of justice, and also what help them to maintain this political conception of the person, right, of identity. And we would like to finish, if you don't have anything to add, Rafael, saying that this answer goes along with the thesis of the independence of moral theory. See, what Rawls is saying is that, again, he's saying that institutions and the results of moral theory, of the implementation of some idea of justice, they have a huge influence on conceptions of identity. So it's not just the other way around. We are not slaves to what scientists of psychology and neuroscience and philosophy of the mind tell us. So it's also the other way around. The way we live, the way we conceive our institutions also has a deep influence on conceptions of identity which are maintained by citizens who live under these institutions, right? So that's it. I believe that that's would be Rawls's answer to part of it, a more complete and reconstructed, specific account of it, which deals not only with the source of the identity, but also with matters of stability. After all, the political term is about stability, right? So thank you very much for your attention, and we are open to your questions now.
Well, thank you. I like this paper very much, and I don't have much at all to add to it. I will just say this, that Sam Scheffler recently sent me a paper that he's been working on, in which he says, in effect, I give him too much credit, that while his paper may have gotten Rawls thinking about how to make the political term, why he might need to rethink some things in theory of justice, and why certain arguments against utilitarianism didn't work, that the kind of case that I imagine Scheffler posing for Rawls, that led Rawls to think the problems relative to stability problems, is not the sort of thing Sam had in mind, and he was just making a much more modest point than I give him credit for making. So that's one of the things he argues for, but then he also considers the question you come up with and you address in the end about whether the change to political liberalism holds or turns back part of its objection, and he claims that it doesn't on just the grounds that you anticipate. So, so that's about all I've said. That I like the paper very much, and that Sam, to his credit, Sam had the benefit of drawing on a bunch of correspondence he had with Rawls at the time, and lectures he heard Rawls give at the time, and as Rawls was making the changes in his view, stuff that I didn't have access to, that you didn't. But the end result of Scheffler's paper is the end result of yours, that the turn succeeds in turning back the Parthenian objection.
I may say it was Rafaela's impression that, it seems like Scheffler has said something and Rawls's interpretation is something else. It's stronger. I think Rawls interprets Scheffler in a more deep manner than maybe Scheffler might have thought. And that's one of the reasons why we were motivated to deal with it. Right?
Yeah, Scheffler puts it in this paper, crediting me with Scheffler, with persuading Rawls that he needed to fix the kind of stability in political liberalism is like saying that I convinced him he had to be in Boston, and I'm responsible for his having ended up in Los Angeles. Well, it could have ended up lots of places. All I did was convince him to be in Boston.
Maybe it was Rawls who convinced himself that he needed a
Yeah.
time.
Yes, I think that's right.
It's great to be. Thank you, Professor.
Any questions?
Even with Professor Weichmann, the other articles will talk about public reasons, but my question to authors on Professor Weichmann, if he wants to make some commentaries about this idea of citizenship, what kind of public reasons, for example, religious people have to translate it or not. If there is some visions of public reasons that it's not about the article, but and I don't know if you want to do it now or another moment, but just to that you are here in Brazil, I want to hear about you about this question. The better way to understand the public reason, seeing that we have to achieve this political concept of simple of person.
Yeah, and so I think that Rawls believed that this conception of the citizen is one that everybody can be brought to value, and religious people, people who are drawn to various forms of identity politics, might nonetheless come to value the conception of themselves just as citizens, and would want to relate, would see the value of relating to other people as citizens rather than as members of their tribes or their religions. And he thought, of course, that a just society would encourage that. And yet he is prepared, of course, to give religious citizens and others a lot of latitude. They can say what they like in the background culture, which is where the vast majority of political discussion takes place. They can say what they like in public media. In the public political forum, which ordinary citizens rarely enter, all they need to do is be prepared to make good religious arguments or arguments for comprehensive doctrine, if in due course, that is, if necessary. But that seems like a fairly weak requirement to impose, and on ordinary citizens. And I think if you ask what reasons they have to do it, I think he hoped, and this seems quite reasonable to me, that people would come to see the value of the kind of civic friendship and mutual trust that's possible if people relate to one another in the right way. And I mean, I think all one has to do, things you might do, is look at the kind of political paralysis that we've had in the States for many years. There's been various forms of identity politics playing themselves out in the public sphere. And for a while, it was people people bringing religious arguments into the public sphere. More recently, I think other forms of identity have been in the ascendancy. But the consequence is that American politics is very deeply polarized and increasingly antagonistic and increasingly paralyzed. There's just not much getting done to address the urgent problems that we face. And I think the hostility that ultimately stems from refusing to see one another as some kind of civic friends and cooperate to get things done is responsible. I don't know if that helps or goes to the question you were asking. If not, feel free to follow on.
I don't want to get away a lot of this idea of that. Okay, but
I mean, it is astonishing that Wall Street have given so much credit to Sheffield for this short article. But he claimed not to see the implications for his arguments against utilitarianism. The arguments against utilitarianism of the response to part of independence of moral theory. We know that Sheffield was right to say, look, if the arguments in independence of moral theory are right, one of the arguments against utilitarianism can't work. We're all saying just didn't see it. Hadn't seen it until Sheffield pointed it out. And the story that Sheffield tells in this article that he sent me is that, if anything, what Scheffler got Rawls thinking about was the importance of the conception of a person in moral philosophy. That it had been there in theory of justice and in the framing of the original position. But Scheffler pointed this out to Rawls at not only the time that Rawls was trying to respond to Parfit, but also the time in which Rawls was thinking about constructivism, in which the conception of a person plays a very important role. And so, thinking more and more about the role of conceptions of a person playing moral philosophy. And so first he writes this very Kantian work, the Dewey Lectures on Kantian constructivism, and then thinks more about how contentious the conception of a person is that he's relied upon, and that's then what gets him thinking about the need to political liberalism. So Sheffield did fuse like this.
there's other line of criticism about the communitarian, like McIntyre and Sandel, that liberalism sees a person divided in public and I don't know. My impression is that Rawls doesn't work so much in this kind of. It's my impression. I don't know if you in your research you put there the communitarian critic or just the utilitarianism.
Yeah, we know that, but it's not part of our paper. No, maybe it should be.
It's other side of the Kantian view.
Yeah, so simply as a biographical matter, I don't think Rawls is much influenced by those criticisms at all. And I think he thought McIntyre was doing something entirely different. And McIntyre could do his project, and I'm going to do mine. That's
He doesn't care
enough
so much.
Well, if McIntyre's interested in examining the social conditions under which the best human life could be lived, and he, in very short order, concludes that the best life can't be lived in just the sort of situation or just the sort of society that Rawls is addressing, then they're just not going to have much to say to each other. Rawls thinks political philosophy, what does he say? The aims of political philosophy depend upon the society it addresses. Rawls am addressing kind of large modern mass societies that need a conception of justice. McIntyre is willing to say a good human life can't be lived. There's so much the worse for those societies. So I just don't think that Rawls, either one would have thought an exchange was very productive. When it came to Sandel's book, I think Rawls just thought Sandel misread him and point out that it's a misreading and leave it at that. But that's not to say that there might be something to a critique like Sandel's, not as a textual matter, but as a matter of political philosophy. And you might be very drawn to the claim that liberalism encourages a kind of individualism that's ultimately pernicious or self-undermining. And you might think that part of the critique stands, even if as a reading of Rawls it goes wrong.
That's it. Thank you, Rafael, Eduardo.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. See you
So the next one is our host, Franklin. You know Franklin already, but it's very good to present him. He's a PhD student here and also professor at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's a man of 2 states.
So, thank you very much for the introduction, my dear friend. Thanks a lot for again, I cannot thank you enough, Professor Whiteman, seriously. I think I can speak for us all here. That is such a, I don't know, for me it's an honor, and I've learned so much from your work, and I'm learning from your person. So to come here and to be interested to know about our affairs and to hear what we have to say about anything that you haven't really been in touch with. So it's really, I'm learning a lot. So the topic that I'm most interested about is what I think it's one of the most revealing parts of the book is the title is Non-Theist Practical Faith. I think it's here behind. I'm just going to read it. I think it's the best way to keep faith with the argument. I was going to try to speak freely, but let's leave that behind. Let's try to keep the argument here. Okay, and still work in progress. This is my first impression, and probably I'm mistaken. There's a little change, Professor Whiteman, from the article, the paper that you got. Well, let's see what happens. So, this paper, I mostly take for granted Professor Whiteman's interpretation of John Rawls's political term. This means that I find his the most brilliant interpretation that I have ever read on the topic, and that I also have a serious doubt that I will ever be able to see the beauty of this Gothic cathedral as he did. This is sort of a joke that Professor Fontana also said, because that's a metaphor that Professor Whiteman puts forward in his book, that Rawls' theory is as simple and as brilliant and as complex as the Gothic cathedral. Nevertheless, there's a specific conclusion of Whiteman's that I would contend. This is an important change. Rawls' theory of justice can be read as a brilliant and subtle exercise in naturalistic theodicy. That was called, that came from his book about political liberalism. My claim is that once we accept the core question of Rawls' political liberalism, or maybe even of Rawls' entire work, is the possibility of human goodness, it does not prompt us to the different though related search for the relationship between human goodness and the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. That is an God. I'm sorry to clarify. Sorry.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, that's it. I took that from Professor Sally Hasslinger from MIT. That's her expression. So, in my view, when we face the practical faith problem, that is the difficulty to believe that despite the horrors that mankind is capable of under certain circumstances, we can be good and accomplish a just society, we do not need to resort to a theist view of the world. I will try to sustain that the practical faith problem is the strongest form of the problem of evil, which I take to necessarily have a theist assumption. And I quote, "The epistemic question posed by evil is whether the world contains an undesirable state of affairs that provide the basis for an argument that makes it unreasonable to believe in the existence of God." There was also a quote from Michael Toole, that's the entry on the problem of evil in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So my core intuition here is that the practical faith problem is essentially a non-theist question. This means that to foster our practical faith, we can rely on different kinds of explanation on how human behavior can express good character. This is my attempt to read Professor Whiteman's work in its best light. So I argue that Rawls's works by Whiteman answered the practical faith problem instead of the problem of evil. In this sense, I maintain that he faced the problem in its strongest form, and thus his answer meets properly his own claim that, and I quote from Rawls, the problem of political liberalism is to work out a political conception of political justice for a liberal, constitutional, democratic regime that a variety of reasonable doctrines, both religious and non-religious, liberal and non-liberal, may endorse for the right reasons. So let's see the argument. Let us now consider the arguments. Recall that Professor Whiteman explains that one of the reasons we must be concerned with the practical faith problem is history itself. Especially Whiteman seems to have in mind the horrors of the 20th century, for instance, the bloodshed of the world wars and the Holocaust, an event considered by Rawls himself as a point of inflection of his life and career. Sure, it is undeniable that history shows us the surface of horrors that mankind repeatedly performed. On the other hand, if we resort to data instead of our perception of evilness or violence, we realize that quite probably we live in the most specific and non-violent circumstances of our species. That is precisely the thesis sustained by psychologist and linguist Steven Pinker. Contra Pinker, it could be argued that the aggressive decline of violence in the last centuries, despite our perceptions of it, and that's especially true in Brazil, does not entail that we have a natural capable of the good. For example, the species would have realized that for pragmatic reasons it would be better like that. Still, socially speaking, there seems to be evidence that our nature can, under certain circumstances, express good character. In fact, social psychology of the goodness seems to be the motto of psychologist Philip Zimbardo's life and work. In his famous Stanford Prison experiment, Zimbardo describes some atrocities made by randomly selected common persons after an impressively short period of time, tricked by the total situation they were presented to, that is, that of being a guard or an inmate in a poorly supervised and unlikely accountable situation. There's also a movie, I think it's on Netflix in Brazil, called the Stanford Prison Experiment. It is of special attention that after describing the horrors that common people did in his experiment, Zimbardo emphasized that the acts of heroism that took place in the same experiment. He shows that in studied cases, there has always been someone who stood and expressed the good in human nature. For me, it seems clear that his view contributes to Rawls's answer to the practical faith problem. Yet, were the Rawlsian practical faith a matter of theodicy, I believe we would face some inconsistencies here. Recall that being an answer to the problem of evil, theodicy is generally based on the thesis that, and I quote, for every actual evil found in the world, one can describe some state of affairs that is reasonable to believe exists, and which is such that if it exists, will provide an omnipotent and omniscient being with a morally sufficient reason for allowing the evil in question. This again, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the problem of evil. For Pinker's and Zimbardo's works to both support the Rawlsian practical faith, they don't have to share the thesis just quoted. Hence, I suggest that conceptually, the practical faith problem does not necessarily relate to the existence of a true God, especially that Rawls's answer to it does not rely on a theist basis, although it doesn't deny it. That's not written there, sorry. Therefore, stability for the right reasons is the answer to the practical faith problem, and not to the problem of evil, in my opinion. And sorry, I was not written that. That being the case, it is safe to affirm that both Pinker and Zimbardo's work, none of each deal with the existence of a new God, support Rawls's answer to the practical faith problem. Likewise, the theist answer to the practical faith is also able to do the same trick. For instance, think of the earliest Rawls's work, where he explains sin and faith in terms of communion. That's his undergraduate thesis recently published. That being so, then I believe I'm able to claim that the practical faith problem is the problem is a non-theist one. If my reading deserves attention, I believe that it might have support even in Rawls's own text. In the unpublished version of Introduction to the paperback edition of Political Liberalism, presented by Professor Whiteman, we can read that Rawls believes that the question prompted by our doubts whether justice is possible is, and I quote, not unrelated to the question of theodicy. It is said, after fashioning the world, God saw that it was good. So in Genesis, if it is good, a reasonably just society must be possible, and for it to be possible, human beings must have a moral nature. End of quote. Notice that being not unrelated to doesn't imply that Rawls saw it as a problem of evil itself, which would undoubtedly support the Rawlsian natural theodicy. Naturalistic. Instead, I take it to mean that he indeed faced not the unrelated, more general and wider problem of practical faith. Besides, it is of general significance to me that Rawls had some time to think about the phrasing of the above quotation, and that he deliberately decided to rewrite and present it in non-theist terms, again, not atheist terms. Just for some context, that's a part that Professor Whiteman brings. This is an unpublished version of the introduction when he argues for his reading of the naturalistic theodicy. So, based on the above presented reasons, I don't think that political liberalism deals with the question of the existence of a new God, neither gives us reasons to affirm the same God, but rather deals with the question of practical faith in its strongest form. That's why I think that Rawls's hope for goodness does not imply theism. From my perspective, to sustain the Rawlsian natural theodicy, Whiteman seems to believe that Rawls assumes theism. Respectfully, I disagree with that, for to answer the practical faith problem, it doesn't seem to me that Rawls neither have to deny nor affirm a good creator, whatever were his personal beliefs on the subject. That's why I'm convinced that he faced the problem in its strongest form, whereas he searched common ground for the Bible people to believe in and support just institutions. Before going forward, let's take a look at Whiteman's work. Let me begin by quoting at length the first time he tells us about natural theodicy. So, I'm going to ask for your patience. I'm going to read that. Whiteman. So Rawls thought that we can be amenable to the requisite moral development only if we are, or under the right circumstances, can become good. The arguments for stability in political liberalism is sound, vindicate the claim that we can be. If we are at least capable of being good, then, however we may actually behave, our presence in the world need not mar creation. Rawls offers arguments, one consequence of which is that despite the evil for which human beings are responsible, a good creator could still have seen fit to fashion a world with us in it. So I believe this paragraph works to show that the problem of practical faith is a bigger and more sophisticated one than the problem of evil. Indeed, I guess that the problem of evil is a species of the problem of practical faith, that is, the problem of practical faith in the case of there being a God, whereas theodicy is an answer to the problem of evil if ours is an who God. To show it, I suggest we analyze each sentence in the former paragraph in two groups. It's quite clear to me that 1 and 2, so Iago, can you please just go up? It's quite clear to me that the sentences 1 and 2 address the practical faith problem, while 3 and 4 address the problem of evil. It seems evident to me that, logically speaking, there is no reason why to make the move from the question about the possibility of goodness in our nature to the question whether and who Creator made us despite evil in the world. Thanks, Iago. One could argue that my point here bestows nothing but a semantic debate. In other words, the position would claim that Professor Whiteman in fact answered the problem of practical faith problem, and that my problem here cannot reach any further than the use of the word theodicy itself. Actually, the accusation of a semantic debate is quite common from our very dearly beloved Professor David in our liberal disputes. So I really don't think that's the case. Those who think so might find some textual support in the passages like sentences 1 and 2 both quoted, or even this one that follows. This is also again a quote from Professor Whiteman. Let me just read the end of it. Seeing that we can be the kind of citizen in turn completes what I referred to earlier as Ross's naturalistic theodicy, for it vindicates that our goal is a belief of a world that is more just and that can actually be called good. Those who think so, Professor Whiteman's upshot would be that creation is nothing else than compatible with stability in Ross's political liberalism. Respectfully, I do not buy that this is Whiteman's position. He's here, so that's not precisely. But in fact, the identification of quotes that address the problem of practical faith and others that address the problem of evil supports my view that the problem of practical faith is wider in range than the problem of evil. So by answering to the problem of evil, often Whiteman addressed the problem of practical faith, but he must not lose sight of sentences like 3 and 4, for instance, which clearly address specifically the problem of evil, if I'm not mistaken. Also, Professor Zanitari told me I shouldn't keep the if I'm not mistaken, because that's the assumption of every text, but I decided to keep that. I'm just paying tribute to his supervision. Let me emphasize here that the problem of practical faith is not only asks whether there are good reasons to believe mankind can express good character, but also that this goodness will tilt the balance in favor of justice. In other words, according to Whiteman, Rawls thought that we can sustain our commitment to the principles of justice, now I'm quoting, we can sustain our commitment to the principles of justice and to bring about a just society only if we think human nature is not unfriendly to the realization of that society in the world. Recall that this question becomes important once we look at history. When we face slavery, torture, mass murder, the proper kind of intellectual response is, according to Rawls, not to seek merely to control the violence, for this way only weakens our moral commitments in favor of some sort of political realism. Instead, the question of justice is itself the proper answer to these adversities in the most powerful way, to the extent that it keeps our faith that mankind can, under certain circumstances, express goodness. According to Whiteman, Rawls believes that this argument impacts deeply not only on the practical task of political philosophy, but that it as well, and I quote, affects our background thoughts and attitudes about the world as a whole. Recalling that human nature is part of the order of nature helps us to see why this is so. That's from Whiteman, that's the one quote inside a quote from Political Liberalism. I'm tempted to affirm that this failing to conceive our nature as part of as part of the order of nature is what drives Professor Whiteman's to the Rawlsian naturalistic theodicy. Please keep in mind this core assumption of his that the human nature is part of some order of nature. So the following is the only step of Professor Whiteman's brilliant wide political liberalism that I cannot follow. In this part of the book, Whiteman brings the book of Genesis to the debate, and for me this further theistic argument is neither necessary nor sufficient for the purposes of Rawls's work. It is not necessary because I cannot see the reasons why the previous arguments demanded this shift. It is neither sufficient as well, for when we engage in this sort of reasoning, we lose a great deal of our audience, because then the belief in a just and stable society hangs on the widely debated question of the existence of God. To restate it, according to Whiteman, the word has value since it's worthy of reference, and, this is a long quote, since the order of nature includes human nature, we can regard the world as a whole as holy, or as worthy of devotion and reverence, only if we recognize that our nature is part of what makes the whole the world of nature that way. We can recognize that only if we regard ourselves as capable of living rightly. The task of showing that we have moral nature is therefore necessary to show how we too can judge the world as a whole to be very good. My guess, end of quote. My guess here is that this precise attitude of reverence that thus shaped is what calls the existence of God in Whiteman's reading. All due respect, I must disagree with him in this precise question, for worthiness of reference is not only an attitude prompted before God. I believe that this is precisely what Whiteman has in mind when he writes about his religion without God, for instance. Therefore, I'd rather read Professor Whiteman as showing that Rawls's political term is totally compatible with the new God, although he does not necessarily rely on this highly controversial ground. Apparently, Whiteman interprets Rawls as if we need some transcendental basis to express goodness, whilst I beg to differ. I'm ready to sustain that we as a species do not need to rely on anything rather than ourselves and our interests to mutually relate as free and equals to support, believe in, and strive for a just society. That is precisely my core assumption when I read Whiteman, according to which, I quote again, Rawls reads Kant as saying that our lives must express our moral nature. He says that, quote, our life in the world and the world itself lose their meaning and point unless we follow the moral law as it applies to us, and strive to fashion in ourselves a firm goodwill and shape our social world accordingly. So I'll just conclude now. In sum, what is at stake here is to show that the question for stability is the answer to the practical faith problem instead of the problem of evil. Thus, as an answer to the problem of evil, I present some key features of a theodicy as well as some theoretical assumptions to defend it. That would be on Augustine when I further developed the argument, and some to debunk. And here you have John Mackey and Bertrand Russell, for instance. I believe that this precise sort of disagreement is a problem that would undermine Rawls's stability. In this sense, I suggest that the Rawlsian stability should not be read as a naturalistic theodicy. I'm sorry about this mistake. That is, as an attempt to answer the problem of evil. Arguing for the stability as an answer to the practical faith problem suggests instead how this reading meets more adequately Rawls's intention with his book, for it states the question and its answer in a manner that does not go for the matter of the existence of a new God, making it therefore amenable to a wider variety of explanations of human goodness than again is embarked on the thinker, for instance. For those reasons, I believe that it can be sustained that Rawls not an exercise on natural theodicy, since his beliefs in the goodness of mankind rests on a non-theist basis. Moreover, and I'm almost done here, I must emphasize that if this argument is sound, I do not have to deny that justice as fairness has a religious aspect. To understand it, suffice it to mention that according to Rawls, quote, what gives a view a religious aspect, I think, is that has a conception of the world as a whole that presents it as in certain respects holy or else as worthy of devotion and reverence, end of quote. So once again, I follow Whiteman, for whom Rawls's work clearly crosses this threshold, therefore stands as a religious view. What I do not buy is that its religious aspect makes it a theodicy exercise. Finally, it feels like this conclusion contributes to the literature, for it highlights and might even improve some core aspects of the question that lies at the heart of Rawls's political turn, the belief that religious and secular people can share faith in themselves and in the arrangements by which justice is institutionalized. The razão de ser, Leandro would say that better than me, so the reason to be of Rawls's political liberalism according to the author himself. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me start with the Gothic cathedral, and then I'll move to the substance of the paper. I wish the metaphor of a Gothic cathedral had been mine. In fact, I took it from a philosopher called John Chapman, who wrote an early review of Rawls's theory of justice, I think in the American Political Science Review. Chapman had the distinction of being Jerry Gauss's mentor, and I think I was probably drawn to Chapman's review by Jerry. That's not the end of the story. So Chapman describes Rawls's theory as having the intricacy and beauty of a Gothic cathedral. I used that in the beginning of the book. Anthony Layden, who actually contributed a blurb to the paperback edition, reviewed the book and said, and the review was nice enough to include something that could be excerpted as a blurb, but he opened it by saying something like, Rawls's view may be a Gothic cathedral, but Weithman should remember that not everyone wants to be shown every last chapel, nor will they all benefit from the experience. So, he thought the book was too long. Anyway, now to the heart of the paper. So I think Franklin is quite right that I didn't adequately distinguish the problem of evil from the problem of practical faith, and maybe to draw the distinction adequately now and help to summarize how each of the problems is supposed to go, or how an argument built on each of the problems is supposed to go. I take it the problem of evil points to the amount of evil in the world, whether natural evil or human evil, and claims that the amount of evil in the world gives us reason to doubt the existence of God. Perhaps the reasons are said to be conclusive, perhaps they're said to be probabilistic, but in any case, the argument from evil is supposed to move from a claim about the amount of evil in the world to doubts about the existence of a new God. Where the problem of practical faith points to the evil in the world, and its conclusion is supposed to be a conclusion not about the existence of a good God, but about the goodness of human beings. And the conclusions are quite different concerning quite different entities, God on the one hand and human beings on the other. And Franklin's quite right that I think to distinguish the two of them, in part by using the word theodicy in connection with the problem, what I meant to be the problem of practical faith, when it's a word so often associated with the attempts to rebut the problem of evil instead. So it's worth spelling out, I think, just for discussion's sake, the problem of practical faith a little bit more detail, and why it's a problem exactly. And I take it the idea is something like this: that if we did not have some reason to believe that human beings are good, then, or we didn't believe that a just society is possible, then our own adherence to the moral law, our own attempts to do the right thing, would seem to lose their point. They'd seem to be futile. And so we have to have some kind of belief that a good world is possible, whether it's a Kantian highest good or a Rawlsian just society. We have to have some grounds for believing that that is possible if our own attempts to follow the moral law or to do the right thing are to have any point at all. We're not just a lapse into despair about doing them. Okay. And yet the goodness of humanity, or the possibility of a good human world, or the possibility of a highest good in Kant's sense, isn't something that can be demonstrated. We have to have faith in it. And that's why it's a problem. So it's a practical problem because without solving it, we don't have, we lose the ability to go on. It's a problem of faith because the possibility in which we have to believe can't be conclusively demonstrated. So we've got a problem of practical faith, and we attempt to address that by providing some argument that a good world, a good state of affairs, or a just state of affairs, a state of affairs that complies with the moral law is possible. So in Rawls's case, I think the argument does not depend upon the existence of God. I think Rawls thinks you can give an argument for the possibility of a just world by looking at certain features of human moral psychology, and most notably our tendency to reciprocity, to return good for good. And out of reciprocity and a theory of justice that is built on principles of reciprocity, we can come to a belief that a good or a just world is possible. Kant, of course, Kant may have thought that in order to comply with the moral law we needed grace. I gather that's disputed among Kant scholars. But I guess what Kant did think is that in order to make sense of the possibility of the highest good, or in order to understand the possibility of the highest good, we had to postulate the existence of a God who would match virtue to happiness. So Kant proceeds from the problem of practical faith to the existence of God, postulation of the existence of God, the immortality of the soul. But not perhaps because he thinks we need God in order to be good, but just because we need the existence of God to make sense of the highest good, to understand the object of practical faith in all its complexity. I don't think Rawls goes there. I think Rawls thinks the object of practical faith, that is a just world, can be vindicated just by our naturalistic psychology. But having vindicated, we might go on to draw some further conclusion. If one believes in God, as I think Rawls did sometimes or in some ways, if one believes in God and one sees all the evil in the world, even if we think that the evil doesn't call into question the existence of a good God, we might still wonder why in the world God made us, or why in the world God could look at creation, why God could look at creation and pronounce it good. And so one thing you might think is, well, if a just world is possible, then maybe God didn't go wrong in rendering that judgment. So the solution to the practical faith problem in Rawls's hands isn't meant to vindicate the existence of God, but to vindicate this judgment that a good God on whom we have independent grounds to believe would render the judgment God did. I don't know if that all makes sense. I could go into it in greater detail if you want. Is there some...
I think all of us would.
Okay. So, because it wasn't clear, or?
No, because it's good to hear it from you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I don't think everyone here read the book, so maybe it would be
Yeah. Okay.
clarifying.
Yeah. So.
If it's not a problem.
No. I'll try to say more without being more confusing. And I do think that what I tried to get at the end of the book, of the material that Franklin touched on, is one of those deep questions that I think really bothered Rawls. He was really, as I said in the opening remarks, bothered by the question of whether human beings can be good. And at least in his undergraduate thesis, he was bothered by the possibility, or bothered by the question, which looms large in at least some elements of the Christian tradition, of how God could create a world and look at it and pronounce it very good, knowing what was going to happen. And yet you could vindicate that divine judgment if you could show that despite all the evil that human beings visit on one another, it's at least possible for them to be good. And so if you can show that it's possible for us to be good, then you can both vindicate the divine judgment and provide us the practical faith we need to go on to comply with the moral law. And so I think part of what Rawls is trying to do in showing how a just world, showing that a just world is possible, is to address those two difficulties. And it's parallel, I guess, to what he took Kant to be trying to do. That Kant wanted to show that a realm of ends is possible, or a kingdom of ends is possible, and the highest good is possible. Because without the belief in the possibility of the highest good, adherence to the moral law would be pointless. We would see no good reason to do it. So does that help? Or maybe I just repeated what I said before.
Yeah,
I'm not
a little
sure
bit.
much. Okay.
Let's open to
Yeah, let's open it to questions and see where people would like it to go.
So that's interesting because I always relate this, some passages of Rawls on questions of justice
with Hannah Arendt's theory of moral theory in totalitarian regimes, because she doesn't seem to accept a altruistic moral in this kind of regimes. Seems like Rawls says something similar, maybe, because justice doesn't demand heroic attitudes or supervillain attitudes, neither egoistic attitudes. We are in the middle with the reciprocity principle or reciprocity psychology. And it's interesting because Hannah Arendt asks, so what kind of moral can we demand each other when we live in this kind of regime? In totalitarian as this, let's say, regime. And she says it's not, we do not need to, how can we translate it? We shall not do evil. Maybe something in this kind of circumstance.
Yeah, so I think Rawls didn't talk much at all about totalitarian regimes. I mean, I think he would have said that we can't infer much about, we should be wary of inferring much about human nature or human goodness or badness by seeing how they behave in extreme circumstances, including the circumstances of a terribly repressive, invasive regime. So you find out that in an invasive regime, people, or in a totalitarian regime, people, as Václav Havel said, cease to care about truth. They lose a commitment to truth. Or we shouldn't infer a lot from the fact that under a regime of constant surveillance, like I guess East Germany was, that people will all spy on each other to get by. Not a whole lot to be inferred from that. Instead, what we want to ask is what people might be capable of under decent circumstances. And this too is a place where I think he learned from Aristotle. Look at what citizens of a good regime are like, and identify a good person with a good citizen of the best regime. And Aristotle and Rawls have quite different ideas about what the best regime is, but I think they both accept the view that a good person is a good citizen of a good regime. And Rawls thinks that we can be good citizens of a just regime or a just society because we have a tendency to reciprocity or a tendency to respond in kind. It's also why we can be bad citizens under a bad regime or bad people under a bad regime. I mean, if we're treated badly, we'll respond in kind. If a society tramples on people, they will respond in kind of resentment and alienation. On the other hand, a society that treats people well and provides them the basis of respect and provides them liberty and the means to make use of it, people will reciprocate and stabilize it. And so it's the tendency to reciprocity, which, as you said, is not neither egoism nor altruism, but midway between. It's this tendency to reciprocity that he thinks enables us to sustain a just society. And it's the root of human decency or goodness as he understands it. It's not the root of human perfection, and perhaps human perfection demands much more than reciprocity. But goodness, decency, what we need to sustain a commitment to giving one another justice, reciprocity is the
Well, I'd just like to mention that though he doesn't directly address totalitarian regimes, which is also, I think, one of the reasons that Spurgeon says that Rawls is a dwarf in philosophy. Yeah, but anyhow, I really find your argument here quite compelling when you say that to answer to the problems of violence, the proper philosophical inquiry is to think about human goodness, because if we do otherwise, we'll lose our moral commitments. So I found it really brilliant.
I think Raymond Boyce, against whom I directly, has just given up. And perhaps that's an understandable reaction. But I think Rawls wasn't quite ready to give up on this.
Yeah. Let's remain the practical faith.
Yes.
I'm thinking about a classic episode, Crito, from Plato and Socrates. the dialogue, the arguments are prudential ones and reciprocity, but in the final moment, I think that what reveals that Socrates maybe he stands his view in a kind of believing in a kind of believing I don't want religions, but towards religions. He talked about the other life and so on. But I don't know, came in my mind now because maybe what Rawls is saying that we have to believe in the possibility of human goodness. It's not based on only reciprocity or prudential arguments, but kind of human nature. I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud, but maybe it's a response for the lack of faith of the article. I don't know.
I do think it's important for him that the motive to do justice not simply be prudential. I was just at a conference a couple of weeks ago on a book by somebody called Peter van der Schraaf, who's published a big book called Strategic Justice. And it's a marvelous piece of work that deploys very sophisticated game theory, goes far beyond the kind of stuff that I know. And yet, one of the claims at the heart of this theory of justice that van der Schraaf has developed is that the motive to do justice is simply a prudential motive. And I just don't think that that's right, and it's certainly not Rawls. I mean, it's very hard for me to see how just acting justly for prudential reasons makes justice a virtue. I mean, maybe it makes it a human artificial virtue, but it doesn't make it a moral virtue. It doesn't make justice a good-making quality of persons, as far as I can tell. And while there are lots of differences in the philosophical tradition about what sort of motives the just person acts from, whether it's love of excellence or whether it's respect for the law and the categorical authority of the moral law, it's certainly not, for large stretches of the tradition, simply rational prudence. And it's certainly not for Rawls rational prudence. At least in theory of justice, we're to be motivated by the categorical authority of the law, by the fact that the principles of justice are laws we give ourselves as free and equal persons, and they're rooted in our reason. The story of political liberalism, of course, gets more complicated, but it's in no case is it going to be, if van der Schraaf buys into the overlapping consensus, then for some people, perhaps, the motive to do justice will be prudential, that Rawls is, I think, open to and hopes for considerably more.
So, Professor, I'm going to take your paper as an opportunity to try to present my question about stability in a better version. Okay? So I think that about this thing, the concept of recognition, or as I prefer, the concept of acknowledgement, is a relevant concept. So when I ask, is stability a so relevant problem? I mean, can we solve problems about stability with philosophical arguments? Is this not a question that is beyond the limits of the philosophy? In this sense, to me, follow Habermas, the fact that it has could possible the emergence of a theory of justice in our history as a species is not a possible cause of a future or a better future society. It is a symptom of our capacity to produce a better society. A symptom of something that is described in our Constitution as members of a species that just could be adults socializing after a long process mediated by intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity is not an option, just our personality, our constitution as individuals are totally dependent on structures of intersubjectivity that from Hegel to Honneth have been known as structure of recognition. The structure of recognition or the structure of acknowledgement contains itself a lot of normative demands. And the possibility of a theory of justice is, from the point of view of the social theory, like Habermas or Honneth, a symptom of the possibility of intersubjectivity equal and free that has been developed theoretically. Beyond this, if we could or not assure, if we could or not assure trust that our conception of justice will produce a stable society or not, it seems to me, I think that it's impossible to assert philosophically. This is a political problem. And in the political debate, the philosopher is just a citizen like anyone. So I don't think that the stability is not a relevant thing. I just think that it answered some questions that, from my point of view, don't need any answer. So the possibility of a society equal and free is described in our Constitution as human species. Or it points to some questions that we cannot answer philosophically. This is my point.
I wanted you to say something and you add.
I would like you to answer that, but before going on, I think you might recall that answer that I presented to you yesterday. And to answer that, we recast this question because I would split your thought in two moments, because I believe that if if you take stability as something important, if you really get stability in Rawls, I do believe that when it's institutionalized, justice trends can stabilize itself, and I really believe that this guy here answered that and say, okay, he shows this why. You just have to institutionalize that, even with the fact that pluralism still would work, even if you just take the ideas common to the family of liberal theories. Yeah. What I think, and I would understand your question as highly challenging, is that what we talked yesterday about non-ideal theory, but a social, a critical theoretical like that we would hate this distinction. He always tells me that. He was on my master's exam, and he said, no, don't think like that, it doesn't count. But I think that's a problem that we share, and I think Leandro and Iago, Rafael, we all close the course and say, okay, we're sure that if institutionalized, it will stabilize itself. What should we do now? I mean, it's not institutionalized. It doesn't seem it's going to get institutionalized soon enough. So what you do with Brazil, with the current Brazilian situation, is, okay, he's shown us how it stabilized itself. What are we going to do now? It's not institutionalized. So should we go to politics, something like that?
It's still a conception of justice. And well, it's a topic for the weekend. But in my opinion, it holds for no-ideal circumstances.
Okay, so
With some adjustments.
wonderful. Let's believe that. But I don't know if that's a good answer for you. I would just first, I have doubts. I'm not sure what to do with how to put this beautiful, and it's beautiful, thing working. I really don't know. It challenged me a lot. I'd love to hear you about this argument that you pointed out about the possibility of that our evolution through linguistics, which is intersubjectively mediated, that brings us this reciprocity thing in our almost DNA. I think that's pretty much of his argument, right? Because this equality is inside us since we evolved through language.
Yeah, so if there's more evidence than Rawls musters about the inherent character, of reciprocity, or the tendency to reciprocity, or intersubjective justification, desire for intersubjective justifications in our nature. That's all to the good, I think. That is, it seems to me to help Rawls out if we can bring forward further evidence of the central claim about our nature and our tendency to reciprocate. He doesn't draw on those Habermasian arguments about about intersubjectivity being caught up in the nature of language, but I don't have any reason to think that he would want to distance himself from it either. And I do take the point about how little philosophy might be able to show about stability. Just as I suppose there's not much that theoretical economics can show about equilibrium states. You can prove the possibility of a general equilibrium. That is, you can prove that all markets will clear. That it's possible that all markets will clear even without central economic planning authorities. But that possibility should be realized depends on a whole host of circumstances in the political economy that we might be very, very lucky to get. And philosophy can't ever prove that we're going to get them, and mathematical economics can't prove that we get them. What it can do is show that an equilibrium is possible. And similarly, I think what Rawls can do is show that given certain assumptions about our psychology, an equilibrium is possible. Or an equilibrium once achieved can be self-sustaining. But that's the most that he can do. He can't tell us how to get there, and doesn't try to.
Okay.
And if I can add, that stability is important for our conception of justice. That's a question. If you have to decide between two conceptions of justice, stability is an element of decision. That's a philosophical question.
Yeah, that's a very important one, and one in which people divide,
Yeah.
right? And Gerald Cohen thinks, for
Yeah.
example, that
It's not important.
it's not important. And I can think my way into Cohen's position. If you show me the Sermon on the Mount, and I say, oh, people can't ever live up to that. My conclusion isn't so much the worse for the Sermon on the Mount, it's so much the worse for people, right? The ability of people to live up to moral precepts, you might think, doesn't tell us anything about the moral precepts, it tells us more about ourselves. And similarly, if Gerald Cohen's right, the inability of people to sustain the right principles of justice is Cohen's. The inability of art to sustain them just tells us something about us or about the capitalist structures in which we live. It doesn't cast any aspersions at all on the principles of justice Cohen wants to defend. So I can think my way into his argument, and I take your point that the assertion of the importance of stability is itself a controversial philosophical position.
Your question it's about maybe the Ross's views is a utopian. No?
I like so much Ross. And I agree that the problem of the stability is a problem to us. Okay. I doubt if the stability question is a philosophical question or a question that with which we can deal philosophically. Okay.
So which stability question, just so I'm clear?
So, The Theory of Justice, okay? It's a great book. A great book. And
Okay, we're ready.
But, yeah.
well,
Once I've heard that everything before the blood is false.
sometimes I wonder if Rawls, as the greater intellectual that he was, if he does not if he did not take so seriously a lot of questions raised that was raised about the theory of justice. And the point is, if the conception of justice in a theory of justice would or not be a possible conception of justice, socially effective, is not a question that we can answer philosophically.
Yeah, so maybe that's right. And so it's important to distinguish various questions of stability. And suppose Rawls's question of stability is just this. I've finished the first part of theory of justice. I've proven that the principles of justice are collectively rational because they would be adopted by parties in the original position. But it sure looks to me as if there's a potential problem of the agreement being undermined by a prisoner's dilemma. What I'm going to do is show that that won't happen. So my question of stability is this agreement reached in the original position going to be undermined by a generalized prisoner's dilemma or not? That's my only question of stability. Here's an argument that it wouldn't be. There are other really important questions of stability out there. Those aren't the ones I'm going to touch. And maybe he adds something like this. The reason I'm really interested in the problem of a generalized prisoner's dilemma is that Hobbes was interested in it. And Hobbes thought the only way to avoid disintegration by a prisoner's dilemma is to put an absolute sovereign in place. Nobody wants that. So I'm going to give another answer to the question Hobbes asked. Okay? It's been on the agenda of political philosophy for a long time, and I'm going to give a different answer. There might be lots of other stability questions out there that I'm not going to answer, but that's the one I'm going to take up, because it's Hobbes's.
Okay. Main point is from Hobbes to Rawls and Dworkin and the others, the foundation of social relationship is something like the fear of the death. So, I have encountered you, and I had fear that you could take your arm, okay? The foundation of social relationship in the tradition of social theory is not the fight of life or death in the Hobbes tradition, but the fight for recognition. So the social relationship is not something in which I could desire to kill you. And because of this, we need to stabilize that relationship in some way. The social relationship is ever a fight of recognition. Where I need you with me to the constitution of me as an individual. So the social relationship is from the beginning as a human social relationship stabilized. Maybe the main point of difference could say here. What is the fundamental interaction? A fear of the death or a fear of the lack of recognition? I don't know.
Are they mutually exclusive of the thing? Are they mutually exclusive of some excludentes? Because I think that would be, I don't know what's your thought about it, but that might be the Hobbesian individual, but the Rawlsian individual, the Rawlsian citizen, also has a sense of justice. And so he wouldn't interact with each other by the fear of that, or it would be mere rationality.
But even nowadays, the Hobbesian theory is not just like this. I think Sharon Lloyd made wonderful work on Hobbes and Leviathan, because for Hobbes, like she reads Hobbes, it's not just life or death situation. You have very different moral agents in the state of nature. Like, yes, you have the self-interested agent, but you have the moral agent and you have the religious agent. So you have a lot of relations.
And you have people who, all of whom, attach importance to respect from others, right? Yeah. And what people dislike is not just the threats that others pose to their mortal life, but also the threats they pose to their own self-esteem, right? Isn't respect of others very important to Hobbes? And it certainly is to Rawls.
And Rousseau.
And Rousseau, yes.
That's why Rawls adopted an Aristotelian principle, most like to respond this kind of reaction. I don't know.
Yeah, and the companion effect. People appreciate one another's excellences.
In sports, certainly, Aristotle.
So this is really interesting. We could keep talking about it. You're the timekeeper.
No, actually he is.
Oh, he's the timekeeper. Okay.
But I know we're really short on time. There's just one last thing I'd like to be a professor with, if I may, Leandro. Just one quick question.
Yeah.
If I can recall, Rawls somewhere says that he decided not to be a priest, and he, I don't know, somewhat didn't have this Christianity anymore because he couldn't buy the original sin. After writing all of this and to believing that very good it was, what do you think? And it's quite personal. You might not want to answer it. What are your thoughts on the original sin? Is it compatible with the very good nature of the world?
Can you repeat that?
The original sin, because Rawls couldn't buy that we have a corrupt nature. That was his, if I'm not mistaken, that was his reading of the original sin. If we lost it, there would be no reasons for us to believe in ourselves, and everything would lose purpose. So I'd just like to know your thoughts of if that's your reading of the original sin, and if that's, and how do you see that compatible with the, just if you want to.
I don't think myself that Rawls, even at his most orthodox, attached much importance to original sin. So in the essay to which you're referring, On My Religion, he talks about his loss of faith, loss of Christian faith anyway, and associates it with various wartime experiences. But he said that before the war he was an Orthodox, believing Episcopalian. And yet if you read his undergraduate thesis, which is a thesis in religion, on the meaning of sin and faith, it does not read to me like an Orthodox, the writings of an Orthodox Episcopalian of that time. I mean, what I did, I had to review the undergraduate thesis, and so what I did was actually read the creed of the Episcopal Church, and the Articles of Faith of the Episcopal Church, and read Rawls's thesis. And while he didn't deny any of them, I could find a commitment to only about half of them. And it didn't seem to me that original sin, or the need for sacraments, or the need for salvation, played any role at all in his religious views, even at the period of his life that he claimed was the most orthodox. So I don't think he himself ever had much truck with original sin. And so when he later departed from the Christianity he previously affirmed, I think whatever he might have said, it was less about original sin than it was about just finding himself unable to believe anymore in God who is provident and involved in our lives after the Holocaust, which affected him deeply, and the bombing of Hiroshima, which affected him. So that's about him. What do I think? You know, G.K. Chesterton, the English humorist, said, "The original sin is the only Christian doctrine for which there's empirical evidence." And yeah, it's hard to quarrel with that. I guess the way I try to square the circle, to the extent that I can, is say, well, Rawls never said, social contract theory never said that just institutions would make us perfect, but that they'd make us reasonably just. And so the experience of living under institutions of religious toleration had made a remarkable change in people's religious attitudes, their attitudes toward people of other faiths. The experience of living under institutions that prohibit slavery has made a remarkable change in interracial attitudes, even if they're far from perfect, at least in my country. And I'd like to think that institutions which realized equality of opportunity and which satisfied something like the difference principle would make a change in the way human beings relate to one another of comparable magnitude. That still leaves a lot of room for sin. Okay. And so, whether that manages to square the circle or not, I'm trying to do it. Thank you very much for the paper and for the discussion. I didn't mean to take your job as timekeeper. I figured that was.
I guess. So, we have to go to the last one?
We have the last one.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah, we pass back.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Okay, sure. Great.
I don't want to be the timekeeper, you know.
I know that was right.
Which one?
Tu consegue se ligar um pouco a publicidade? Só um pouquinho. Hã?
Como é que eu faço isso?
Não, só se tu conseguisse. Assim. Não, tem que ter alguém.
Pois é.
So much to read. Wow. Yeah.
Once again.
You ready? We should wait for Franklin to return. No.
It's up to you.
Oh, no. It's the time.
Quer que eu te avise, então? Eu vou controlar aqui, mas qualquer coisa. Porque se tu fizer com a carta de 20, ela vai fazer muita diferença.
For a minute, I thought that was an airline bottle of whiskey. Maybe it is.
That's good.
Just kidding. Just had it. Alright, so thank you very much. So this time I'm not going to be talking about matters of identity and sort of stuff. I'm going to talk about public justification, right? So the presentation is called When Public Justification Meets Justice, a Defense of Consensus and a Defense of Justice. I'm going to be
talking to you and using the board as well, just for a couple of examples. And again, feel free to interrupt me and raise questions and so on. So, it's a debate. In public justification theories, there's this very sort of specific debate between these two conceptions of public justifications, which are the consensus model and the convergence model. Some supporters of consensus are, most known as John Rawls himself. And to the other side, we have Pierre Boss, Kevin Bellier, John Fresher, and lots of other authors. And I begin by trying to provide and actually also reconstruct an answer already announced by Professor Whiteman in another work, in a chapter of his 2016 book. And I intend to develop it further in a written and longer paper, but here I'll be talking about it more quickly. But I see that this response takes us to another debate, another level. So I try to grasp the next step, right? Next step to be followed while debating with those guys such as Gauss, Bellier, and Fresher. So the problem raised by Jared Gauss, and I'm basing myself here more specifically in an article published in 2011, which is called Tale of Two Sets. You'll see why two sets in a minute. I will explain that. And it goes on like this. Should one develop the requirement that citizens resort to shared reasons shared by all citizens, in order to facilitate some justificatory equilibrium on social norms, social rules? In other words, I question whether the model of public justification used by Rawls in political liberalism should be replaced by a model of convergence, which seems to be less demanding, right? So, in the first part of my presentation, I explained this problem, this challenge raised by Gauss, and I tried to come up with a proper response to it, which is based on political liberalism, right? On some features of the account of stability presented by Rawls' political liberalism and very well explained by Professor Whiteman. So, in the second part of my presentation, I tried to develop some reflection on this further debate, because I began by saying that it's a presentation on public justification, right? You remember that? That's not true. That's not the whole story. I believe that this is not just about public justification, but it's about justice as well, right? So I believe that Whiteman's announced response to Gauss is worth of some development, some reflection on it, and it points to the next step, which is to see that this is not only about public justification, but it's also about how public justification plays some specific role in theories of justice, right? So we are not dealing only with theories of public justification. We are dealing, after all, with theories of justice, right? And this distinction is very important because these authors such as Gauss, Bellier, Fresher could come up with an objection, which is, why justice after all? Why do you need to deal with it? Why can't we just rely on legitimacy, right? I'll try to develop a path for reflection over this question, which is a very difficult one. I cannot offer a proper and fully developed response to it now. It's it's a $1 million question. My supervisor, which was the timekeeper, has already said that maybe I should write this down on my thesis after 2 years and some months, but I'll talk to him later about it. So for my presentation now, I will begin by clarifying these assumptions and this challenge raised by Jared Ross, right? So this first part is the defense of consensus, of the model of consensus. And the second part, I'll try to come up with a project, an attempt of a defense of justice in general, right? So my defense of consensus goes like that. First things first, let's clarify what public justification theories are about. So they try to answer to the question of when are we able to judge, to consider some institution, some policy, some social rule to be legitimate, right? So they are about legitimacy. They offer us some insight into when can we accept some rule as legitimate. That's all, right? Of course, this says some more things, but when we can consider some rule to be legitimate, maybe we have a reason to comply to it. But these are different, though very related questions. So the main question is legitimacy. And there is of course disagreement on what legitimacy demands, what are the requirements, what is the proper procedure, and all that. Who is to justify and to whom? So there are several models of public justification, and the Rawlsian one developed in political liberalism is just one example, right? And this debate between consensus and convergence is a debate between two different models, two different specifications of what legitimacy demands. So when does consensus obtains? So we're going to use the board to draw. You are able to grasp it and not joke
Maybe
about
over here.
Here?
Better for
Okay.
the camera.
No problem. So consensus obtains when two people agree on some rule, some institution, some policy, using the same reasons, right? So imagine that we are debating over some piece of legislation P, and we have the citizen A, which in fact agrees with P. So he thinks it's a good policy, it's a good solution, is in public debate, and he comes up with a reason R to justify P, to show his fellow citizens that P is a good solution, right? It's a just solution. So imagine we have this second citizen B, which also thinks that P is a good solution. So he agrees with citizen A, so far so good, and he uses the same reason R to show that P is correct. That's consensus, right? They not only agree on P, on the piece of legislation, statute, and so on, but they also raise the same reasons. So they are shared reasons, right? So that's consensus, and that's part of Rawls's political liberalism. At some point, he uses this as a device of public justification. Compare this to a different situation. So both agree on P, again, that's the same, but citizen A raises reason R A, and citizen B raises this reason R B. See, these are different reasons, and so they are not shared reasons, and that is convergence, right? There's a good example. I don't know if you came up with this example, but I remember you using this. Imagine we are debating over some piece of legislation which prohibits pornography, right? And there's a group of feminists who think this is a good legislation because, you know, they have reasons related to feminism to think that pornography is bad for women, and so they agree on this legislation. And on the other side, we have some deeply religious citizens who also agree on that because they think that pornography is a sin. So they have completely different reasons, but they agree nonetheless. That's convergence, right? And the feminist does not need to affirm or to think that religious arguments, religious reasons are good, are just, but they agree on the solution nonetheless, so that's convergence, right? It seems somehow easier to achieve, and the challenge posed by Gauss is that we should rely on that and substitute consensus for convergence. And here's why. Well, he begins by saying that we should facilitate an equilibrium, a justificatory equilibrium over social norms, right? We should make it as easier as possible. And in order to do that, we might think that the most citizens participate, take part on public justification, the better, right? So we need more citizens which are part of public justification. So again, the board, and 1 minute, please. I will erase that so I can have more room. So Gauss explains in a hypothetical example, two sorry for that. Yeah, two requirements for public justification. Number 1 and number 2. So number 1 says that we need to resort to shared reasons in order to justify some public some public norm, right? So it's called freestanding justification because these are shared reasons. They are not particular reasons to a comprehensive view. And requirement number 2 says that we need to have reasons related to our comprehensive doctrines in order to fully justify some piece of legislation, right? So these are two different requirements of public justification, and both have play some role in the Rawlsian model, and both are required. So now imagine 4 groups of citizens, A, B, C, and D. I should have come up with funny names in order to make this presentation more funny and attractive, especially because we are already very tired. But so it goes. Imagine that for a group of citizens A, both requirements. What?
Flamenguistas.
Yeah, this is Gabriel. This is George, Jesus. This is Philip, Louis. And this is little Rafael.
Did you get it?
No.
No. It's soccer, Brazilian soccer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so both conditions obtained for citizens Gabriel Barbosa, most known as Gabigol. And it means that Gabigol has reasons which are shared by all citizens in order to approve that solution, but he also has reasons based on his comprehensive doctrines, which you might think says that Flamengo is the best team. So, imagine Group B, which are called George Jesus, which is
the idea was
least
to render your presentation more attractive. It didn't work.
Yeah, don't listen to
us. I won't listen to you. We are the champions this year. So for Group B, only one obtains, right? So this citizen has shared reasons, which in political liberalism are provided by those ideals and the political conception of justice and all that, but he does not have reasons related to his comprehensive doctrine, right? It seems not very stable, but let's follow. Let's go on. For citizen C, just letter requirement number 2 applies, and for D, none of them. This is Renato Gaúcho.
Yeah.
Right? So, what Gauss is saying is that when we look at this example, this hypothesis, consensus only obtains for these two, right? Because we need shared reasons, and the only citizens which are affirming which are using shared reasons are citizens A and B. But if we check convergence, so we see that citizen C is also part of public justification. So there are more groups of citizens participating on public debate. So it facilitates an equilibrium, and justificatory equilibrium over social rules. And that's why we should rely on convergence and not on consensus, right? That is Gauss's point, Gauss's challenge. So yeah, enough with soccer and the board. I'll just sit down here to proceed. So how might we respond to Gauss? Well, in one of the chapters of his 2016 book, Professor Whiteman announces a proper response. I believe he's not dealing exactly with this article, which I studied, but with other works by Jared Gauss and Kevin Bellier. And this response relies on those assumptions which I have already explained, but not fully detailed manner previously in my other presentation. So you must think that when we enter an well-ordered society, institutions might play an educative role, a transformative role. So some ideals and conceptions might grow, might be encouraged, and these are those ideals which I already mentioned, such as civic friendship, citizenship, and democratic governance. So people would care about it, right? And this is why they have reason to affirm the political conception of justice, right? And once, and this gets to the overlapping consensus, which you already are familiar to. And as long as an overlapping consensus obtains, so there are shared reasons available. So the case, so the group C of citizens in Gauss's example is okay. It's probably it's possible, but it's not the typical case. It's not something we might worry about. So what I'm saying is that consensus, so relying on shared reasons, is more it's easier. It's more of a typical case of a well-ordered society than getting to direct convergence over social rules, right? So that's the response. I think there's plenty of textual evidence in John Rawls's political liberalism to show that, and I'll just use a quote which is also used by Professor Whiteman, and here it goes. It's Rawls in political liberalism. A reasonable and effective political conception may bend comprehensive doctrines toward itself. So, again, comprehensive doctrines are amenable to change, and they change due to the role played by just institutions, and as some values and conceptions grow, are encouraged, we may reach an overlapping consensus. That's the second part of the whole story, but I think this is enough for us now. So I believe it's a good answer. It's a very satisfactory one. It's good, but as I have already announced at the beginning of my presentation, I believe that just like some people say, you liberals, you theorists of justice, you come up with arguments for everything. You come up with solutions for everything. But you need to show us why we should care about it, why we should follow you. So I think that Gauss, Vallier, Thrasher, all these other authors would ask us, okay, this seems fair enough, but well, enough of fairness. right? So why should we be concerned about justice? You came up with a whole narrative about how justice might an overlapping consensus might obtain. Well, this is very this is pretty impressive, but is it what is it about? So why not rely on legitimacy?
Mhm.
It seems easier. It seems, you know, more feasible. So why justice and not only legitimacy? Because you see, Rawls is theories of public justification. I'm not denying that. It's very important. But what Professor Whiteman's great reconstruction of political liberalism shows us is that public justification plays a specific role. It's a specific step towards justice, towards justification of a conception of justice, towards its stability, right? So, after all, Rawls is not a theorist of public justification, or not only a theorist of public justification, but also and mainly a theorist of justice. So, the last part of my presentation is about that. It's about how might we respond to that? Why justice and not only legitimacy, right? So, and it's a consequence of the response I brought in the first part, and which was based on Weifman's work. So, there are several ways of defending the idea of justice and the fact that it is important to care about the problem of justice. One of them might be that we care about justice because we do care about justice. It's a fact of our society, of our public culture, of the culture of modern democratic societies. So this idea of a society as a fair scheme of cooperation, this idea of a society regulated by just institutions, is it's part of our culture. It exists. It's a normative reality of our modern societies. I think it seems pretty good, fair enough, and maybe some pragmatists or critical theorists, just like David, have more to say about that. Whether we hold or not this ideal, which are the normative claims implicit in our institutions, but that's not the way I want you to go through here, right? Because I think it's not enough to make explicit what are these ideals and conceptions, what are these normative claims. I believe we also need to test them, to check their consistency and how they fit together with other ideals, conceptions, and consequences of a society regulated by them, such as pluralism. So an example of that might be the idea of a well-ordered society. Just like all the other ideas of Rawls's political liberalism, it's somehow found in political culture. That's its source. So it's political constructivism, right? We make up some procedure for choosing some principles, and all these fundamental ideas are found in the political culture. But it's not enough. We should test if where does this idea takes us? How far does it take us? There would be enough room for pluralism, for discovery, for experimentation in a well-ordered society? Well, I believe that's a question worth of our attention, and it's somehow a defense of justice, because if we defend these ideas related to justice, if we not only make them explicit, if we also defend them and check its feasibility and how they fit together with other ideas, well, we may come up with some reason to follow the investigations related to these ideals, right? So I intend to provide some quick defense of the idea of well-ordered society in comparison to the idea of an open society, which is the idea of society raised by Kevin Vallier, John Frasher, also Jared Gauss, and which some of you might recognize by the work of Karl Popper, which is more famous. more famous than those others, I think. So, and this is interesting also because I believe it to be somehow the current state of art of literature. So there's a very recent article published, written by John Thrasher and Kevin Vallier. It's from 2018, last year. It's called it's called Political Stability in the Open Society. Right. So in this article, these two authors raised two objections against the idea of a well-ordered society. So I'll deal with one here because I think it's easier to be dealt with. And the other, I will briefly show what I believe to be a Rawlsian proper response to that, based on Professor Whiteman's work as well, but which I believe needs some more careful examination, because I do not believe that some of my friends who are not very fond of theories of justice might be satisfied. So the first objection is there's not room for experimentation and discovery in a well-ordered society. What does that mean? So this objection stems from the intuition that due to reasonable disagreement, which prevails in liberal societies, there are unknown features of principles of justice, institutions that embody them, and about their application. So we might not know exactly what justice demands here and now, while applying principles of justice and designing institutions, policies. We might not come to the best solution right now. So how do we deal with it? So we let some room for experimentation and discovery. It's reasonable to think that in the future, maybe in a later future, we come up with a better idea, with a better response to our problems. So there's this need to experimentation with institutions, policies, to check the results and where do they lead us to, and come up with better ideas and substitute our previous answers to that. My reply is that this description of the well-ordered society is not proper. It's not good. The Rawlsian description makes plenty of room for discovery and experimentation, and there are several hints. There are several arguments to show that, but I will rely on one or two here very quickly, and so it goes. Recall that when an overlapping consensus obtains, we reach agreement over a political conception of justice, right? That's already known by you. But that doesn't mean that we have achieved all the solutions to institutional problems, or we have a proper and specific design of our society. It just means that we have a common ground, right? We have a criteria to use when we enter public justification. We rely on the principles of justice, right? So they do not offer us given answers. They are not specific descriptions of institutions. So there's a lot of disagreement in how to institutionalize and apply those principles, and there is where room for discovery and experimentation obtains, right? So this can be illustrated by the massive amount of work which deals with those two ideal models of society already announced but not fully described by John Rawls, which Professor Whiteman already mentioned earlier, which are the property-owning democracy and the liberal socialism. We work with this literature here at this university, and there are lots of works and lots of different solutions. There are socialist solutions, capitalist solutions. Some capitalists ones look like socialists and some socialists look like capitalists. You know, if that's not experimentation, I don't know what that is. And I believe there's room for it in a well-ordered society, right? So that's my response to this objection. As to the second objection raised by Kevin Valier and John Thrasher, and that's the last point of my presentation, I'll be ending up in a moment. So we might question whether this experimentation and discovery, disagreement, would reach the bounds of justice itself, right? So the very political conception of justice would be subject of disagreement. So there's room for it in the well-ordered society. I believe this is I believe no, it's explicit, but it's a version of the well-known asymmetry objection, which says that you theories of justice, you deal with pluralism in a different manner as applied to justice and as applied to the good. And this is arbitrary because pluralism would apply to both in a similar or in the same manner. So you consider it to be a feature of your model of society that there's great disagreement over the good. There are lots of comprehensive doctrines which may exist and persist on a well-ordered society, but why is not like that with conceptions of justice? What would a conception, even a political one, a conception of justice, be maintained, be continuously affirmed by citizens? Well, I don't have a great answer to that. I would very much like to hear it from you, Professor Whiteman, but I would like to end this presentation with a quote, which goes back to those effects of just institutions over citizens, right? When we live under free institutions, we might come to cherish some ideals, and that's why we would affirm a conception of justice. So I'll quote Professor Whiteman now, and it's, if I'm not, yeah, it's his book, his 2016 book, not like the Equilibrium. So the crucial question is what members of a just society would think of themselves as free to do. Rawls offer a clear answer. They would think of themselves as free to form, pursue, and revise their conceptions of the good. So this is disagreement over the good. It is in part by encouraging this conception that free institutions encourage pluralism about comprehensive doctrines. Yeah, so far so good, but let's check this out. By contrast, institutions of a liberal society do not encourage their members to think of themselves as similarly free to form and reveal their own conceptions of the right. So pluralism applies differently to justice and to the realm of the good. Indeed, the citizens cannot. For if they did, they would in effect encourage their members to rethink the liberties that allow them the freedom to pursue conceptions of the good and to rethink the conception of themselves and their citizenship that justifies those liberties. So I would like to hear it from you, Professor Whiteman, that if that's a final defense of justice, and if you maintain that, I believe it's a very strong argument, but you know, would Gauss be somehow satisfied with it? So that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And before I turn to the paper, I should just thank all of you. You all have been here the whole day. Thank you very much for coming. And this has really been a wonderful occasion for me. It's very flattering to see how much attention people have given to the work that I've done, and I just can't thank you enough for that. I really do appreciate it, and I guess special thanks to you since you made them all read it. And got such good papers out of them. With the fear of God, either it was the Good Coffee Place or the Fear of God. I don't know which it was, but you got very good papers out of them. So thank you very much. Just a couple of things in response to this very good paper, and then we can throw it open for discussion. One is that so I appreciate your focusing on the argument of Gauss's and his students that you did, and thinking now of the argument that you illustrated with reference to the 4 soccer players whose names I didn't recognize. But, and you're quite right that Gauss does say it would be myopic and undermine the relative stability of the social order simply to exclude the third of the soccer players, or the third and the fourth of the soccer players. What really worries me about Gauss's view is his further stipulation that, I mean, if we really insist on 2, as he thinks we should, if we really insist on, as he does, that social policies at all levels of generality be justifiable to everybody in light of full information, then everybody gets veto power. And we end up, not surprisingly, with a very minimal liberalism, a kind of libertarianism. And that's what really worries me about his view. That is what I find the most worrisome argument, and the one that I most want to resist. Now, he says we don't end up with anarchy because people have a stronger interest in reaching a solution than they do in having their favored policy enacted. And so people are willing to compromise because we have an interest in avoiding a state of nature. But still, we end up with a very minimal state, and that, I think, is a quite worrisome implication of the justificatory strategy that he employs. So, but he also offers the argument that you considered, and I'm glad you took it up. As for the material at the end, so you're quite right that there will be room for disagreement about justice, even in a well-ordered society. The Rawls himself leaves room for disagreement about justice, and the room is quite capacious, I think. And he says that there'll be debate, debate among adherents of different liberal political conceptions of justice. And the constraints on liberalism strike me as quite minimal. They're that the rights and liberties, which have that identify certain fundamental rights and liberties, grants them a special place, and guarantees people adequate all-purpose means to make use of their liberties. And those taken together are pretty weak. I mean, single out basic rights and liberties. Give them a special place, not necessarily lexical priority, as he insists in theory of justice, but some kind of a special place, some kind of special protection that forbids them from being traded off for greater prosperity. And I assume he's most worried about the political liberties there, because those seem to be the ones that societies are most willing to trade off for prosperity. And adequate all-purpose means, whatever that means, it certainly doesn't require the difference principle. And those 3 constraints do, I think, leave lots, as you say, would leave lots of room for disagreement about justice. And I would think disagreement, as much disagreement as there is in any free society. And which of those would Gauss and his students want to experiment about or entertain disagreement about? What do we want to discover by calling those into question? Yeah, I'm just not sure what the answer is. But I also think, I mean, it's, I suppose, a rhetorical question, because I don't think there is a good answer to it. Moreover, I mean, I would want to place a lot of weight on the claim that people who grow up in a society that somehow honors those 3 constraints are going to develop some allegiance to them and going to see that they work for their good, and will, one hopes, not want to rethink those, because they are, as I said, so minimal. I mean, I would think even people on the American, far end of the American right would grant that people ought to get adequate all-purpose means. They just have far too minimal a sense of what adequacy is. But I mean, even people on the far right of the American political spectrum, I think, could endorse all 3 of those. And so there's, I would have thought, enough disagreement about justice in America to satisfy Gauss and his students. So, I hope so. But thank you for both of your papers. They've really been nice pieces of work, and I appreciate them. But as for your last question with Gauss, Jerry's a friend of mine, but he's never satisfied.
So just a quick detail. So Chapman was his mentor, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Because Chapman came up with this idea of the cathedral.
Yeah.
And there's an article by Jerry Goss. It says that, the best way to regard political liberalism is not as a already built cathedral, but as a project. So that's the best view of political liberalism. So he's just, saying the contrary.
I had forgotten he said that. I'd forgotten that Jerry said that. But it was Jerry who, I'd heard of Chapman, but it was Jerry who got me to read some of it. And when I was reading early reviews of Theory of Justice, I ran across the review of Chapman's and thought, well, if he was a mentor of Jerry's, I really should read it. And that's where the analogy was found.
I like to listen to both of you about this, because Gauss and others, they also develop another structure of argument, not based on exactly on constructivism, but in the evolution of cooperation. And it's a different kind of model. What do you think about this kind? Because it's much more related to Hume than to all like a junction of Hume and Kant. And also, what I think interesting in Gauss is the importance that he gives on social norms, like this informality dimension that we have, that maybe we can try to enrich the well-ordered society with this other structure. Maybe, I don't know, like developing and seeing how social norms will evolve in a well-ordered society, and how we can get out of social traps, maybe, or like some prejudice and some bias or something like that.
Yeah, it's very sometimes difficult to read Gauss's and various structures, all these works, because it relies on some difficult material of empirical studies and economics and game theory. Yeah, it's totally different. But you see, this worry about social norms is maybe I don't know what you think of that, Professor Whiteman, but this whole explanation of how an overlapping consensus would obtain, it provides us with some reasons to believe that these ideals of civic friendship and so on would be encouraged, and that's some sort of social asset, which I think would be also a strategy to deal with that. And I'm not quite sure of how where do this takes us. But there's an article by Kevin Vallier as well, in which he comes up with a distinction between first reason and second reason norms. I don't know if you've heard about it. And he believes that an ideal model would have two of these kinds of reasons in order to publicly justify. And second, and both kinds of norms are presented, are in political liberalism. So I don't say, at least for Vallier, there's such a huge distance between the two models. He said that he thinks that convergence is better because it's easier to achieve. So in in the non-ideal case, convergence is better. But in the ideal case, we should rely on not consensus, but congruence. So I believe that they might be somehow closer at the end, although they for sure rely on a different path to come up with their ideals of society.
So you probably read the material by Vallier and Kuss more recently than I have. I read Order of Public Reason when it came out, and I don't remember many of the details, but I do remember, with respect to social norms, that Jerry's kind of minimalist about social norms too, because he finds that drawing on the work of sorry?
Christina Bicchieri, no?
No, well, I was thinking of well, he draws on her too, but I was thinking of Strawson's work on the moral emotions and the reactive attitudes, and he thinks that Kurt Beyer too, but especially the stuff about the reactive attitudes leads him. I mean, he's quite right that morality, to have a sense of morality, is to be liable to certain reactive attitudes when people violate what we regard as moral demands. But he thinks of morality as extremely oppressive for that reason. That the prevalence of morality in a society leads to people making judgments about one another, which he regards as a kind of tyranny. And so I think he's a kind of minimalist about social morality too. And I guess I just don't see morality that way. So that's about all I have to say about his view about social norms. Is just that we have a quite different view of how morality operates and what its function is, and how oppressive it is. I also find it hard to see where real normativity comes into the view. Philip Foot famously said long ago that it's important that we find some way of distinguishing morality from etiquette, and that is both seem to operate categorically rather than hypothetically, and both seem, though she didn't put it this way, connected to the reactive attitudes, and yet we have, she claimed, an intuition that morality and etiquette are quite different things. And whenever I read Jerry about social norms, I think it doesn't seem to me that's a distinction he can draw, that morality is just rules of behavior, just like where you put your fork. And I just can't see morality that way. With respect to the evolution of norms, as was said, there's an awful lot of, it's a very complicated view, and I can't pretend to have mastered it. It does seem to me that any view that draws on, or that conceptualizes a social settlement or principles of justice just as a game theoretic equilibrium is going to face the problem of equilibrium selection. There'll just be too many for at least most solution concepts. And so you've got to have some kind of constraint to pick out equilibrium as the favored one, or to at least narrow down the equilibria among which you're going to choose. So Van der Schraaf, the person to whom I referred in the last session, has one highly contentious criterion of equilibrium selection in order to get around this problem. And it leads him to argue that the right theories of justice are egalitarian. He finds a way to get almost Rawlsian egalitarianism out of this complicated game theoretic and prudential structure. If, on the other hand, and I say this is conditional because I'm just not sure, sorry, if the criterion you impose is just path dependency, to whatever equilibrium, the equilibriums are the one we happen to have gotten to, that's just far too weak, I think. You need something stronger than that to rule out equilibria that are, I think, obviously morally unacceptable. That's about all I've got to say about what's a very complicated view.
Right.
I hope this isn't being live streamed to Arizona.
When we invite Jerry, we'll send him the video.
Yeah. I'll invite him with it.
Yeah.
So, what else?
Okay, well, thank you very, very much.
Well, I must say a few words to thank you again, Professor Weissman. We are now having a very tough time in Brazil. the political scenario, and especially the public universities are facing some hard times. So I see this generation that I find extremely promising, and your presence here today, I think, is inspiring and motivating, and it helps those boys and girls to go on. They have the task to prepare a new generation, as I'm doing now, and I think it will be more difficult to you to get some talented students, as I had the luck to have. So it's very special for us. We used to discuss here in a poor country those questions of political philosophy, and usually we don't have the hope to have some great thinkers as you are between us. So it was really very precious for us that you accepted the Franklin's invitation, and so for me it was a wonderful and unforgettable day, and I think for I speak for our guys here.
Thank you very, very much.